Hello everyone. This week we start talking a new topic called supply chain management. Supply chain management is in fact integration of suppliers, manufacturers, warehouses and stores so that products are produced and distributed at the right quantities to the right locations and at the right time. And our aim is to minimize the system-wide cost while satisfying service level requirements. In fact, this definition is not complete. According to this definition, supply chain only deals with the flow of goods. But in fact, supply chain is not only the flow of goods, but also the flow of information and money as well. So we can define supply chain management as the management of materials, information, and financial flows in a network consisting of suppliers, manufacturers, distributors, and customers. Some people agree that logistics deals with essentially the same issues as supply chain management. In fact, the logistics is originated from the military and it deals with problems about moving personnel and material in critical times. It was later adopted by business. And one might argue that although classical logistics treated the same set of problems as supply chain management, logistics didn't consider the supply chain as an integrated system. Here, in this figure, we see this integrated system. It starts from supply, continues with operations, and then ends with the distribution. And there are issues as vendor management, inbound logistics, and raw materials in the supply part. And in the operations part, production scheduling, MRP, in-process inventory control, and capacity planning are the issues that supply chain management deals with. And lastly, forecasting, customer service, finished goods inventory control, and outbound logistics are the issues that supply chain management deals with. In the scope of this course, in fact, we discussed most of the issues in supply chain management, such as scheduling, MRP, inventory controls, and forecasting. Now, I would like to talk about supply chain as a strategic weapon. It's a strategic weapon because supply chain reflects a company's strategic positioning. For example, there is a trade-off between cost and response time in supply chains. If the company prefers ground transportation, I mean transportation by boat, truck, or rail, they may decrease the transportation cost but will increase the response time. On the other hand, if the company prefers air freight, then they are able to decrease response time but increase the cost. So in fact, these decisions are up to the company's strategies. Or another example is that the companies may make their deliveries with their internal systems, or they may subcontract the logistics operation to a third party. And third-party logistics is becoming more common. Besides logistics, companies may also subcontract their manufacturing. For example, there are companies such as Foxconn. This is a Taiwanese multinational electronics manufacturer. And this company is achieving a significant economies of scale by providing manufacturing services to large number of firms producing similar products. In this way, it may be less expensive to subcontract manufacturing than to do in-house. For example, the company Apple is also outsourcing to Foxconn. Because in fact, cost is not the only issue for Apple. Apple realized that their core competencies lie in aesthetics and innovation, not in manufacturing, so they prefer to outsource their manufacturing. Or Cisco Systems also outsources to Foxconn, and they have transitioned from a manufacturing focused company to a design focused company. So, according to the company's strategies, they make different decisions in their supply chain management. And key elements of effective supply chain should include the use of information, analytics, and incentives. Since one of the key elements of effective supply chain management is the use of information, now I would like to talk about the role of information in the supply chain. Information plays a key role in the management of the supply chain. You know, at the moment we are living in the information age and the availability of information is increasing at an exponential rate. New sources of information are created every day. And in supply chains, information is power. It provides the decision maker the power to get ahead of the competition, the power to run a business smoothly and efficiently, and the power to succeed in an ever more complex environment. For example, think about the beginning of operations planning. We start with the forecast of sales. And according to these forecasts of sales, we build a plan for manufacturing or inventory replenishment from those forecasts. And of course, these forecasts are based on information. And I would like to give an example from a company called Barilla for the role of information in supply chain. And this example is really popular in many operation management courses, and it is given to prove the role of information in supply chain. This company is an Italian company that specializes in production of pasta. And in the late 1980s, head of the logistics in that company introduced a new methodology called just-in-time distribution. And according to this methodology, in fact, the idea was to obtain sales data directly from the customers. And by using this data, Barilla determined when and how large the deliveries should be. In those times, in fact, that company was a traditional company. I mean, its customers were making their plans individually. I mean, plans for the orders. They were using standard reorder point methods. But when Barilla checked those orders, they saw that there is wide swings in the demand on Barilla's factories, and this was due to the bullwhip effect. Now I will, in fact, later I will talk about bullwhip effect in detail, but shortly I can say about this effect is that even the demand for a product is very steady, the orders to the manufacturing company may have variation, and we call this as bullwhip effect, and this variation is because of holding safety stocks. And after applying this just-in-time distribution methodology, they saw that the results are striking. Delivery reliability improved, and variance of orders placed on the factory were substantially reduced. So the program proved a win-win for Barilla and its customers. In fact, today we call this as vendor-managed inventory systems. I mean, this Barilla example, the methodology used in that example, just-in-time distribution methodology, is an example for vendor-managed inventory systems. For example, some companies like Procter & Gamble now takes the responsibility for keeping track of inventories for several of its major clients, such as Walmart. For example, think about your local supermarkets. Sometimes in our local supermarkets, we saw staff checking the inventories in the shelves, but these staff do not belong to the supermarket. They belong to the manufacturers. Because now it became the manufacturer's responsibility to keep the shelves stocked. Because these stockouts certainly hurt the retailer, they also hurt the manufacturer even more. Because when a customer comes and cannot find the product, then prefers another product and may continue to buy that another product. This means that that manufacturer lost that customer. For that reason, as I mentioned, losing a customer may hurt the retailer, but it hurts the manufacturer even more. Now I will explain you the bullwhip effect. In fact, I introduced that bullwhip effect in the Barilla example. Before using the just-in-time distribution, Barilla was observing this effect. This effect was firstly introduced by Procter & Gamble. They were studying one of their best-selling products, baby diapers, and they saw that the demand for diapers is pretty steady. But then they saw that the orders placed by distributors had much more variation than sales at retail stores, and furthermore, they observed that orders of materials to suppliers had even greater variability. In fact, when the demand for it is steady, we would expect that the variance in the whole entire supply chain would be low. But this is not the case, and we call this as bullwhip effect. This is also called whiplash or whipsaw effect. Now I will show you a figure, and with this figure it will be more clear for you this bullwhip effect. Here in the first graph, we saw the consumer sales for a product. Here you can see that the demand is steady. It is within this interval. And after this graph, we see the graph for retailer orders to wholesalers. And you can see that the variation increased. This is because probably the retailers keep safety stock for the uncertainties in consumer sales. For that reason, here, for example, at these times, they order more, but then after that, they use those stocks, so they do not give order. And then after this, also we check the graph of the wholesale orders to manufacturer. So you can see that now the variation increased more. And lastly, we check the manufacturer orders to suppliers, and here we see that there is huge variation. So this is called the bullwhip effect. In the bullwhip effect, even the demand of a product is steady, we can have variation in the other stages of the supply chain. There are several causes for the bullwhip effect, and these primary causes are demand forecast updating, order batching, price fluctuations, and shortage gaming. Now I will talk about these causes one by one. Let's start with demand forecast updating. When each individual in the supply chain give their own decisions about the orders, this bullwhip effect occurs. I mean, for example, the retailers keep safety stocks to protect themselves against the uncertainty in consumer demand. And these safety stocks cause the retailers' orders to have greater variance than the consumers. Then the distributor absorbs these swings in the orders of the retailer, and then they even keep larger safety stocks, and this goes on like this and causing the bullwhip effect. Secondly, order batching. Remember the EOQ formula that we discussed in inventory control management? According to this formula, when there is a setup cost in the orders and when this setup cost is high, then we prefer to give the orders less frequently, I mean with batches. And this causes batches, and also these batches cause bullwhip effect. Price fluctuations also cause bullwhip effect. When prices fluctuate, there is a motivation for distributors to hold inventories. And also when manufacturers give good offers, I mean when they offer promotions to the distributors prefer to give large orders. And also they make some agreements with the manufacturer, and they may buy their products in advance of need if the manufacturer give good offers to the distributors. But all these cause bullwhip effect. And lastly, the last cause of bullwhip effect is shortage gaming. Shortage gaming occurs when a product is in short supply. I mean when the manufacturer could not supply all the orders. But in this case, for example, if the distributor know that the manufacturer will only supply half of the orders, then they simply double the size of their orders, and they are in fact doing this to be able to supply all their orders. But for the manufacturer, this may cause many problems, because if the manufacturer assume that these orders are real orders, then the manufacturers may decide to make investments on their factories. They may decide to increase their capacities, but in fact these are not real orders, so they may have problems with shortage gaming. We discussed the causes of the bullwhip effect. In fact, the bullwhip effect is not the result of poor planning. I mean, people are making their plans, but the problem is that they are making their plans individually. I mean, they behave selfishly. They make their individual plans and they are trying to optimize their position, and this causes the bullwhip effect. Now we will discuss what can we do for this bullwhip effect. I mean, there may be some solution methodologies to cope with this effect, and they are information sharing, channel alignment, price stabilization, and discouragement of shortage gaming. Now we will start discussing all these solution methods. Let's start with information sharing. All parties in the supply chain should share information on point of sale data and should create their forecast on these data only. Information sharing can be accomplished by several techniques, and one of them is electronic data interchange. And now we see manufacturers link directly to sources of point of sale data, and manufacturers make their forecasts according to these data. And second method to cope with bullwhip effect is channel alignment. Channel alignment is the coordination of efforts in the form of pricing, transportation, inventory planning, and ownership between upstream and downstream sites in the supply chain. But order batching is one of the factors that defeats channel alignment. Reducing fixed cost will result in smaller order sizes. And one of the important components of this fixed cost is the paperwork required to process an order. But with the new technologies such as electronic data interchange, these costs could be reduced. And when we reduce the fixed costs, we can also reduce the size of the batches. And another factor motivating large batches is transportation economies of scale. When we increase the size of the batch, in fact, we are able to reduce the unit transportation cost. But we can deal with this problem with outsourcing of logistics. With the outsourcing of logistics companies can consolidate loads from multiple suppliers, and in this way, with also small size batches, we can obtain less unit transportation cost. Thirdly, with price stabilization, we can reduce the bullwhip effect. Pricing promotions motivate customers to buy in large batches and they store items for future use. This is very common in the grocery industry. But with stabilizing the prices, sales patterns will have less variation. And now, major grocery manufacturers such as P&G and Kraft are moving toward a value pricing strategy, and they are moving away from promotional pricing for the same reason. And lastly, discouragement of shortage gaming. In shortage gaming, the customers know that the manufacturers will not supply all the demand, so they exaggerate the number of orders. And to cope with this problem, the manufacturers may allocate the products based on past sales records rather than on orders. And this will motivate the customers not to exaggerate their orders. And several companies are moving in this direction now. Now I will talk about transportation problems that we can encounter in supply chain management. In fact, this transportation problem can be viewed as a prototype supply chain problem. Of course, in real life, problems about shipments of goods are much more complex than the problem that we will discuss. But you can assume that this problem is only an illustration of the issues and methods that one can encounter in practice in supply chain management. In the transportation problem, we assume that a fixed amount of product must be transported from a group of sources to a group of destination points. Now we will assume that our sources are plants and our destination points are warehouses. And we know the unit transportation cost from each plant to each warehouse. And our aim is to find the optimal flow paths and the amount to be shipped on those paths to minimize the total transportation cost. Here we have an example. In this example, there is a company producing tablet computers, and this company have 4 warehouses. And here in this table, the amount, the percentage of total production that the warehouses have is given. You see here. And the company have 3 plants in Sunnyvale, Dublin, and Bangkok. And the aim of the company is to send the products produced in the plants to these warehouses in Amarillo, Teaneck, Chicago, and Sioux Falls. Here in this table, the amount of production in each plant is given, and also we know the percentage of the production that the warehouses will get. So by using these percentages, in fact, we can calculate the total shipment quantity to these warehouses. Here in this table it is given. This is a balanced transportation problem. What I mean with the balanced transportation problem is that the total supply is equal to total demand. I mean all the products produced will be sent to the warehouses. And also in the problem, unit transportation cost between each plant and each warehouse is given with this table. And here you see the figure, plants and warehouses, and all possible paths are given in this figure. So our aim is to find the optimal paths and also the amount of flow that will go over that path will be found with the solution of this problem. And here is the mathematical model for this transportation problem. We define M sources, and here in this problem M is 3. And we define N as the number of sinks, and in this problem it is 4. Cij is a parameter, it is the cost of shipping one unit from I to J. And here is our decision variable, Xij. Xij is the flow from source I to sink J. And our objective function is to minimize total transportation cost. So I multiply my unit transportation cost with my decision variable and sum them over I and J. And I minimize this objective function. And here are my constraints. My first constraint is for the supply. I write this constraint for each of my plant, for my each I, and I am saying that the amount of flow going out of the plant should be equal to the total capacity of that plant. AI is the total capacity of a plant. So I sum my Xij's over J and make it equal to AI. And in the second set of constraints, I satisfy the demand requirements, and I write this constraint for each of my warehouse, for each J. And here what I do is that the amount of flow coming to each warehouse should be equal to its demand. So I sum my Xij's over I and make them equal to Bj. Bj is the demand of the warehouses. And lastly, I have the non-negativity constraint saying that all Xij's should be greater than or equal to 0. And this was the algebraic form of the formulation. And this is the formulation written in the expanded form. Here the first 3 constraints are demand constraints, and the last 4 constraints are, the first 3 are supply constraints, and the last 4 are the demand constraints. And here the first equation is my objective function where I minimize. Let's check the solution. This is a very simple transportation problem, and it can be easily solved with Excel solver. Here we see the solution from Excel solver. We see that, for example, X14 gets value. So I see that my first plant only sent the products to the 4th warehouse. And here X21 and X22 take values. The second plant sent the commodities to both warehouses 1 and 2. And lastly, I see that the third plant sent the products to the warehouse 1, 3, and 4. And this is the optimal schedule for this transportation problem. In the transportation problem that we discussed, we assumed that there are paths from each origin point to the destination point. But this may not be possible in some cases. I mean, there may be some infeasible rules. For example, in the previous problem, assume that the company decided to eliminate the routes from Dublin to Chicago and from Bangkok to Sioux Falls. Here, we have no path from Dublin to Chicago and we have no path from Bangkok to Sioux Falls. To cope with this case, in fact, we do not have to change our mathematical formulation. We can still use the same formulation, but what we have to do is to assign high cost to the unit transportation cost on these infeasible paths. We call this high cost as big N. We will assign a high cost, so the model will not assign any flow on these paths. And when we assign this high cost and solve the problem, we see that our objective function increased slightly because we expect, in fact, this increase because we restricted the problem when we removed these paths from the problem. And also we can have unbalanced problems. We discussed the balanced transportation problem. I mean, we assumed we said that total supply is equal to total demand. This is balanced transportation problem. And when we have unbalanced transportation problem, we can have two cases. The first case is demand can exceed the supply, and the second case is supply can exceed the demand. And we can cope this case in two ways. The first way is to assign dummy nodes to either supply or to the demand node. I mean, if the demand exceeds supply, then we assign a dummy supply node. But if the supply exceeds demand, in that case, we assign a dummy demand node. And we can assume that transportation cost to these dummy nodes is 0. And here in the previous example, it's saying that assume the demand increased and the total demand became 278, whereas the total supply is 260. So we know that we will not be able to meet a demand at an amount of 18 units. So we will firstly, let's assume that we defined a dummy supply node. And when we solve the problem with this dummy supply node, we obtain that from this dummy supply node, 8 units are sent to Chicago and 10 units are sent to Sioux Falls. It means that we couldn't supply the demand of Chicago with an amount of 8 units, and we couldn't supply the demand of Sioux Falls at an amount of 10 units. Another way to cope with unbalanced transportation problems is to change the sign of our equations. You know, in the balanced transportation problem, we use the equality signs for all demand and supply constraints. But, for example, assume that if the demand exceeds the supply, in that case, for the demand constraints, we can use less than or equal to constraints, and we can still use equal to constraints for the supply constraints, because we should guarantee that we send all the supply. And with the less than or equal to demand constraints, we don't force the problem to supply all the demand. We may not supply all the demand with the less than or equal to constraints. Or think about the vice versa. If the supply exceeds the demand, In that case, for the supply constraints, we can use less than or equal to constraints, and we can still use equal to constraints for the demand constraints. Now I will introduce you transshipment problem. In the previous problem, I mean in the transportation problem, there are two kinds of nodes. These are supply nodes and demand nodes. In the transshipment problems, there are also transshipment nodes. These nodes can also be supply and demand nodes, and they act as transshipment points in the network. And I will introduce you a general rule for all transportation and transshipment problems to formulate. And according to this general rule, when we write the flow balance constraints for the nodes, if the total supply exceeds total demand, then we can write the flow balance constraints as the inflow minus outflow should be greater than or equal to supply or demand. If the total supply is less than total demand, then inflow minus outflow should be less than or equal to supply or demand. And lastly, if they are equal to each other, we use the equality sign in the flow balance constraints. But for this general formulation, we represent supply with negative number, and we represent demand with positive number. Here, for example, in the previous example, we have plants and we have warehouses. Now we have two transshipment points also. In fact, Chicago was a warehouse in the previous problem. Now we assume that it is also a transshipment point. And here we add a new transshipment point, Sacramento. And these two transshipment points are also supply points for us. And as I mentioned, for this general formulation, we should represent supply with negative numbers. Here you see the supply of the plants with these negative numbers, and we represent the supplies with positive numbers. And now I check the problem if it is balanced or unbalanced, and when I check it, I see that total demand is more than the total supply, so it is an unbalanced transshipment problem. So I check my rules. Here I know that my total demand is more than my total supply, so I will apply these flow balance constraints. I mean, inflow minus outflow should be less than or equal to supply or demand, and I will write this flow balance constraint for each of my nodes. For example, let's take the first node. This is a supply node. There is no inflow. So inflow minus outflow, so minus x16 minus x14 minus x15 should be here less than or equal to my supply, and I represent my supply with a negative number. Or let's check a transshipment point. Here let's take this node 4. Inflow minus outflow. Inflow is x14 minus x46 minus x48 should be less than or equal to 25. Here you see the flow balance constraint for node 4. And we write the flow balance constraint for each of our nodes in the network. And again, my aim is to minimize total transportation cost, so I multiply the unit transportation cost with the decision variables in my objective function. And here you can apply this general rule to all your transshipment and transportation problems. You can apply this rule also to the transportation problem that we already discussed. And that's all that I would like to talk about in this video. We discussed these transportation and transshipment problems. But of course, these are really simple examples when we compare them with the real life examples. In real life, a company may have thousands of customers. In fact, we are able to solve these real life problems with these mathematical formulations. But if the problem size is very huge, we may not obtain the optimal solution. In that case, we may try to find some solution methodologies for our problem. Thank you for listening to me. Next week, we will continue talking about supply chain management. Goodbye.